Hey, what is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. It's that time of week again, and it's the last one of the season. Sad to say, it's been a crazy season. I think we've done 25 power rankings or something like that throughout the year. Of course, a couple other videos. We're going to go through it. Not a lot of changes based on last week, and with only 1 week left in the season, we're starting to pretty much get to the bare bones of what a power rankings is. The bottom two rows, not a whole lot of shuffling going on. Top row, you might see the most shuffling, and we have some teams that are making some weird situations even weirder coming into the last week of this season. Believe it or not, there are still maybe one playoff spot available on each side of the bracket. A couple of teams may be vying for those spots. We'll talk about that quickly, but overall, this power ranking is going to be somewhat quick. We're aiming for 1,500 subs by the end of the playoffs. We are on our way. We're about 85 away, which is absolutely awesome. Did not see that coming this season. So if you're not subscribed and you love baseball content, playoff content, a little bit of that coming as well, we switch over to football as early as this week. We start doing the NFL power rankings as well, and we're kind of switching to NFL as baseball starts to wind down. But otherwise, guys, we're just going to jump into it. I want to just thank everyone that has been here all season long and has witnessed what is possibly the absolute worst season in MLB history. I think they pretty much clinched it today by getting swept by the Padres. I think only one win this week against the Angels. They were playing, I'm just going to throw them up here because I'm kind of talking about them at the same time. They played each other. I was interested because they've both been the bottom two teams in this board for months now, it feels like. And the Angels honestly gave me a scare that I might have to drop them below the White Sox with the White Sox winning. However, the White Sox did lose that series. The White Sox go 1-5. And I think they need to sweep this week to not have the worst record of all time, which we all know is not going to happen. So I think the White Sox are rightfully going to get there. Angels, on the other hand, not a good week for them other than beating the White Sox. They lose to Houston three out of 4 games they lose. And they've kind of had that kind of same story all season long. We're just going to kind of rip through this bottom row because no one really wants to talk about them. Their seasons are over. They all have about 6 games left. Miami Marlins, well, September has kind of been nice to them. They've put up a fight for the most part. 1-2 against the Dodgers, 1-2 against Atlanta. Just a couple of wins against 2 playoff teams. Not really moving the needle for me. Not really paying too much attention to the Miami Marlins. I think they're going to end the season here just a little bit behind their division rival, the Washington Nationals, who had a pretty rough week, getting absolutely destroyed by the New York Mets in the beginning of the week, giving up a multiple double-digit game runs. And its opportunity to really savage their division rival, the Mets' opportunity to make it to the playoffs, they fell a lot short. And after a little bit of promise about halfway through the season, we're starting to see the Washington Nationals maybe move up to middle of the board at best, but they really fell back down. And maybe that's rightfully so. It's a long season. The young guys just not quite at the MLB caliber yet. Losing that and then absolutely losing to the Cubs this weekend. 1 out of 4 did they win. And the Nationals, whatever. Number 26, I did move them up that one spot. They have looked somewhat interesting. They've kind of like inched their way up the board of all the teams we're going to talk about in this bottom row. I feel like they probably have the best to look forward to next year. A lot of their young guys maybe starting to make a little bit of an impact. They had a rough week playing Arizona and the Dodgers. They're 2 big division rivals. The West, of course, super hard. It's not going to be easy for the Rockies to make headway going into next year, but they had a 500 week, beating Arizona 2-1 and then losing to the Dodgers. 500 week against those 2 teams is going to be pretty exciting in this bottom row. A little bit of progress, but the season's coming to an end. They're ready to rack it up. Number 25, the Oakland Athletics. Might be the last time we see on the power rankings or in this videos because we're not talking about them in the playoffs. This logo, I don't know if they're switching logos when they leave Oakland. Don't know what's going on there. Maybe they'll still be the A's, so we'll be able to use that logo going forward. P.S. I see you Brewers fan who keeps asking me to change the logo, and if you can tell me the number 15 in the comments, if it's you, and say the number 15, I will do it for the next video because I want to make sure you're watching the whole video. Otherwise, I don't really care for that comment over and over and over again. I will be changing the logo. It's just takes time, right? So number 25, Oakland Athletics, not a great week. 2-1 against the Cubs. Win the series, but then they play their own division. Oh no, it was the Yankees. They get absolutely beat up by the Yankees. That was last week. They played Houston, but A's not making too much progress. Number 24, We have the Pittsburgh Pirates, who continue to lose in their division. It's just like the story. Losing to Cincinnati, losing to St. Louis, 1-3 against St. Louis, 1-2 against Cincinnati. And overall, I do have them as the weakest team in the Central. I think standings-wise, they're going to end there as well. There's just periods of this season the Pirates just completely crap the bed and complete massive losing streaks. Whereas this division, a lot up for grabs moving into the next season. We don't really know who's going to be the powerhouse in this division. Could be the Pirates. A lot of room for progress. We talk about this every single season with the Pirates. They just don't seem to have it. Number 23, we have the Cincinnati Reds, 1-2 against Atlanta, 2-1 against Pittsburgh. So 500 week. Atlanta kind of laid the hammer on them. Atlanta, of course, having to pick up big wins. Cincinnati not really playing for anything, so 500 week kind of keeps them exactly where they are last week. Next up, we have the St. Louis Cardinals. And guys, as you can see here, we're starting to really rip through the NL Central here. We've got 3 teams in a row, and that's because for the most part, these 3 teams have performed relatively the same all year. St. Louis has had times where they look good, and this week was one of those times. They did beat Cleveland over the weekend, something to somewhat be excited about, 2-1, 3-1 against the Cubs earlier in the week, or against Pittsburgh earlier in the week. Cardinals, they had their times, but by the end of the season, they kind of came right where you would expect them to be, far out of the playoffs, not really competing, and a bunch of younger guys trying to make their name for next year. Number 21, another team that's really trying to figure out what they're going to look like next year. We pretty much saw Bo Bichette get injured one game after coming back after missing months. And then it's been a bunch of no-name new guys for the Blue Jays while they've managed to send out a bunch of solid rotations. So on that top of that, they have a pretty rough week, getting swept by the Rays, a team where I thought for the most part they'd be able to compete. They seem like they're in the same kind of situation. Sure, all the games I believe ended 1-run differential. 4-3 today, 1-0 Friday. I can't remember exactly yesterday, but I think it was 1 run. Overall, the Jays fell a little bit short there. 1-2 against Texas, so 1-5 week overall. Not exactly what you want to see, but they're making progress a little bit ahead of the National League Central, to say the least. And number 20, that Texas team I was just talking about, while they picked up the series win against the Jays, wasn't pretty at times. They managed to get some shutout innings against the Blue Jays, which the offense of the Jays has been somewhat questionable at times, but they followed it up this weekend. 1-2 against Seattle, and they barely squeaked out the win today, but I think they're happy. That's kind of like their World Series kind of series for them, I think, today, trying to really sabotage Seattle's chances at the playoffs. We'll talk about that relatively soon. Number 19, I have the San Francisco Giants, who actually on this whole board so far probably had the best week overall. 2-1 against Baltimore, and then they go in and they play absolute spoiler against the Kansas City Royals, sweeping that series and absolutely opening the door for an interesting finish to the American League wildcard race. So we can thank San Francisco for that. They shut teams down this week, and it was pretty fun to watch, and sometimes they got some runs going. So San Fran, probably one of their better weeks of the year, playing 2 playoff-bound teams potentially, and 5-1 week. Something to look forward to. Potentially could argue they should be in this upper row. A little bit of teams that you could interchange them with. Next up, I have the Chicago Cubs. While they had a massive week against the Washington Nationals, them losing to Oakland kind of, for me, makes it a wash. A 500, they're a little bit above because they played 4 games against the Nationals, but basically a 500 week against 2 bottom row teams, not exactly what you should see. So maybe you could argue Giants come up. But the Cubs, we saw them at points. I think they got as high as 6 on this board, and that was early in the season. They had some of those new guys making big impact, and you thought some of it would keep going, and then just seemed like they had 8 weeks in a row there where they were just absolutely terrible, and they just completely fell, and we saw them sitting in the bottom row for, I think, a couple of weeks. They were in that bottom row, so the fact that they average out from 6 to 25 right at 18 makes a lot of sense how that's how they finish, which is pretty interesting to say the least. Number 17, the team that just always competes, and I love to see it. They just are always going and always fighting, and their pitching always seems to be sorting it out. Arguably could be higher on this board, but we're going to start talking about teams that are in the playoff race or on their way out of it. But Tampa Bay, I think they're 4 games out of the playoffs, and not mathematically eliminated, but I think they need basically a miracle. Go undefeated and probably need a miracle on top of that. So that's pretty much impossible at this rate. But the Rays got to be happy with how this season ended. They traded off a lot of their talent, and they still managed to be a very competitive baseball team and sniffed the playoffs a little bit, and they sniffed 500 for a little while there. So the Rays are got to be excited with how things are going. Number 16. This might be a power rankings first. On the last power rankings of the season, a team that is ranked 16th could make the playoffs. I do believe they are going to be half a game or one game out of the last wild card spot. And it's been one of the wildest collapses, I think, in terms of Minnesota Twins. They were on their way to potentially leading that division right there neck and neck with Cleveland. And it just feels like the wheels have fallen off. Lucky for them, the same kind of story has happened for other teams. While they are one game out, they have an interesting week coming up as well. I know they end the season against Baltimore. I can't quite remember who they play next. I didn't write it down. But they're going to have a winning week if they're going to get back in this hunt, because there's 2 spots ahead of them. Detroit took the spot. The Royals are that. Those 2 teams are tied for those last 2 spots. They have Seattle, who is sniffing 2 games back as well. And that is actually a team I have ahead of them. So in theory, I do believe Seattle's the better team at this point, even though they might not make the playoffs either. Number 15, I do have those Boston Red Sox. And a lot of that has to do with basically how Boston performed today and yesterday against these said Twins. I don't think the game's absolutely over, but Boston had like a 7-run lead in the doubleheader that they were playing. As you guys know, don't do this until the Sunday nighter starts kicking off. But that doubleheader kind of extended. It's kind of an interesting situation, but they expect them to win that series 2-1. Boston, on the other hand, lost to Tampa Bay. So, like, these guys are all in the same kind of ballpark. You could technically argue Tampa Bay 15, and it just gets so sloppy because we're moving Minnesota down to 17 at that point. A team that is in that playoff race, but absolutely playing terribly. But these guys play again this week, Boston and Tampa Bay, I know that, and I kind of am leaning Boston still as the better team, so I kind of think that it'll go that way, and that's why I'm leaving it the way it is now. Number 14, we touched on them briefly. We do have the Seattle Mariners. Would have loved to see Seattle blow out and sweep Texas this weekend, but they fell a little bit short. They are in that playoff hunt, but they're not exactly putting together the kind of weeks you need to make up the ground. They got to hop, I think, 2 teams, right? Minnesota, they do have to hop, who is 1 game ahead of them. And then 2 games ahead of them, they have the Royals and the Tigers. Going 500 this week, 1-2 against the Yankees, 2-1 against Texas. Not exactly helpful in making up ground. Right now, they're on the outside looking in. They kind of need a miracle. I think they have a pretty tough week coming up. I do believe Houston is one of the teams. I can't quite recall the other. Number 13, another one of those teams outside of the top 12, but I do believe, just looking at here, that one of the top 12 teams will definitely miss the playoffs. National League has 7 teams in the top 12, which kind of makes the difference. 13th, Kansas City just has fallen apart, lost 7 in a row now, and this is the worst time of the year to be doing this. They had quite a good cushion coming into this week, and then they just get swept by Detroit, swept by San Francisco. The sweep against Detroit was pretty disastrous because Detroit was 2.5 games back coming into this week, and now they are exactly tied. And San Francisco, a team where you got to at least pick up 1 win, break this losing streak. A lot of concern for Kansas City Royals. I do think, just based on how things are going, Kansas City could potentially find themselves on the outs because they just aren't winning. You got to have winning, and right now the momentum is totally against them. Number 12, Baltimore Orioles. Well, they've clinched the wild card at this point, and it is pretty much a disaster of a season over the past little while. I think they've lost now 6 series in a row, and this might be the only team on the board that had a bad week and moved up the board, because I think I had them 13th last week. I can't recall exactly, but just the fact they went 0-7 made the difference. And Baltimore is pretty much guaranteed that playoff spot. 1-2 against San Fran, 1-2 against Detroit. Pretty much the same opponents that Kansas City had, managed to pick up a couple of wins instead. I guess that's the big difference. The one thing also boosting Baltimore is they are having a couple other guys come back, which is much, much needed into this lineup. But guys, if you're losing 6 series in a row going into the postseason where you're going to play a best of 3, Very likely, I guess, you're going to be third. You'll be the 4th seed playing the 5th seed. You're going to likely see Detroit again at this rate, and you lost the past 2 against them, best of 3. You're going to see Skubal against Burns. Not looking good for Baltimore. I don't like what is potentially down the road here. Number 11, this is the 7th highest National League team, and it is the Atlanta Braves. While I do believe they've been playing stronger than these teams below them in the American League, the unfortunate reality of the situation is that 2 of these teams are going to make the playoffs for the American League. I guess one of these teams, really, right? We're going to get to Detroit in a second, who's number 10. I'm just going to throw them up there. But Atlanta, a good week. They started off really good. You got to be pretty excited. 2-1 against Cincinnati. They did have a Monday carryover game with the Dodgers that they lost. So 2-2 coming into the weekend. And they win against Miami, but they want to see a sweep there. This race is so tight. They are chasing the Mets right now. I do believe they're one game out of the playoff spot. And right now, Atlanta is that odd man out. They do have the benefit that Phillies and Mets play another series. The Phillies, although almost have locked up that number 1 seed or at least a bye in the first round, and the Mets are playing for their life, so it doesn't really work in their favor. But Atlanta, I think, has a little bit of an advantage there. Detroit, we talked about them. They went 2-1 against Baltimore over this weekend, 3-0 against Kansas. So a 5-1 week. This team has erased the biggest games back deficit we've seen in quite a while to make their name into the playoff spot. It'd be pretty disastrous at this point for them not to make the playoffs. They are in the wild card spot. They do have a little bit of a cushion on Minnesota, cushion on Seattle. They do end the season with the Chicago White Sox. So if push comes to shove, you would assume they're going to sweep the White Sox. You got to do it, right? And if definitely with the playoffs on the line. So keep that in mind. I do have them as a 10th seed. Arguably could start moving them up because they've just played that good over the past 6 weeks. Number 9, another team over the past 6 weeks who has just been amazing. These 2 teams have been the come from behind story. The teams that you kind of thought were out at one point probably were sitting down in these bottom 2 rows, and they've worked their way back up into serious playoff contention. The Mets started the week off sweeping Washington Nationals. Absolutely clinical. What I expect Detroit to do when it comes to the Chicago White Sox situation at the end of the week. But it's clinical what they do there, and then they win the series against the Phillies, and they are playing Game 4 tonight, Sunday nighter. So if they can take that 3-1 in the Phillies would be massive in what's going on. But the Mets got to be excited. Managed to sort it out. They still have a tough road. It's going to be tough, but it's between them and Atlanta, I believe, at this point for the last wild card spot. Number 8. I do have the Houston Astros, and while they had a pretty easy schedule the past little while, they ended this weekend 3-1 against the Angels. I haven't really had a chance to see them play too many playoff teams, so I had to base a lot of what I'm feeling about them, their vibe right now. About the early series against San Diego, they lose that game 2-1. The one thing I think going well for them and any team in this American League is that the American League is going to end up being very wide open, anyone's game, and I think Houston, given their experience, given their roster really, should have a pretty decent shot at going deep into the playoffs. But right now at number 8, I do think they match up not as well. They haven't performed as well as the teams that are 7 ahead of them. Number 7, they stopped the bleeding. I was really concerned about them coming into this week because they had been falling off. And even the start of the week, 2-1 against Colorado, they lose that series, a series against the bottom row team where they need to win because they were starting to fall out of the playoff race. They bounced back big way against Milwaukee this weekend, winning 3 out of the 4 games after losing the series last week and salvaging it in the last match of that series as well. They do have a pretty tough, and I think it's going to come down to the very last series of the season where they play the Padres about where they're going to finish. It seems very likely they'll finish 5th. Padres will finish 4th, and those 2 teams will match up again. So that's kind of where the trajectory we're going for there. Number 6. Kind of sitting in the same spot. Nothing too amazing to write home about. 1-2 against St. Louis kind of set them back. I was considering moving them up, but just seems like at times Cleveland just doesn't put it together in the kind of win streak you would want. The series lost to St. Louis. I would have loved to see a series win, getting that momentum. Maybe they took their foot a little bit off the gas because they had basically hit Minnesota way down the board here, winning 3 out of 4 games earlier in the week. Pretty much clinched their division at that during that series. maybe a little bit of release, a little bit of foot off the gas. I want to see them play good baseball this week because they are going to get that first round bye, so they're going to set up a very interesting situation where they're going to be playing the winner of the 3-6 series, which I guess is going to be either Houston or probably whoever finishes in that last spot, right? So they're going to have a pretty interesting road in the playoffs. Very looking forward to them playing Houston at this rate. Number 5, just dropping them out of the top. They were number 1, and the continuous concern I've had for the Phillies all year is whenever it comes to teams that are good or in the top 2 rows of this board, they just don't seem to have the same kind of performances that you need. And you got Wheeler and Nola continuously who are going to perform well, but they're going to be playing best of 5, best of 7 series, and that's where I start to get concerned with this Phillies team playing against these top rosters teams. And it showed again this week, going 1-2 against Milwaukee, 1-2 against the Mets. It's just been a continuous story, and every time you think they're starting to get around and they're top in the league, the top in the standings, they have the best record, you just kind of see the deeper analytics about the teams they're playing, and I knock them down because I don't know if I consider them a top 4 World Series favorite at this time. Number 4, moving up a couple of spots, 3-0 against the White Sox, 2-1 against Houston. Padres have just played very solid over the past month, 2 months, and you got to give them credit where credit is due. They're not going to win the division. They're, I think, 2 or 3 games back, probably not going to win that. They have tough series against Arizona to end the year, but at the very least, they're probably setting themselves up for a nice home series against whoever they're going to be playing against. Padres got to be excited. This offense is getting things done, and for whatever reason, the pitching also getting things done as well. Number 3, did drop them 1 spot out of last week. I do have the Milwaukee Brewers. Milwaukee started the week nice, 2-1 against Philly. I was like, all right, those 2 teams were 1-2 last week. Milwaukee wins that series, goes to number 1, right? That's basically how the board's been going. Milwaukee's been that team that should have been up there maybe a couple times this year. This has been the year when number 1 has the biggest revolving door I've ever had on this channel. But the series against Arizona flashed a lot of concerns for me about winning teams. Of course, they did win the series last week against Arizona, but then we see a lot of runs being given up against an offensive team like Arizona. Then we start to look at some of these playoff teams that they potentially play against: the Phillies, the Padres, the Diamondbacks again, right? Even the Mets have been putting up massive numbers. And I start to get concerned, and then I start to look at, sure, they're massive winners in their division, but then we look at the board and where is the rest of their division? We're looking at all the teams down here, so maybe that's inflated their numbers a bit. Maybe that's inflated their run differential a bit. But at the same time, we do have to give them credit because they have picked up massive series wins. And number 3 is no slouch of a spot to end the season. Shout out to the guy who will tell me to change the logo if you are at this point. Number 2, got the New York Yankees moving up a couple of spots. Got accused by a New York Yankees fan last week of being biased in the National League because I'm an Atlanta Braves fan, apparently. I know I was wearing a Braves hat, but if you're a fan of this channel, you know I changed my hat based on pretty much who's performing good that week, and the Yankees are that team. 2-1 against Seattle, 3-0 against Oakland. A nice little West Coast swing there, and beating up on a team that is playing desperate baseball. New York hasn't had the most amazing season, and realistically, there's been times everyone on this board, even number 1, who we all know who's going to be, everyone on this board has had periods where it's been a struggle. But now we're coming up 1 week away from the postseason. Who is going to be the hottest? Who is ready to play? And right now, I think the Yankees have shown, out of all the American League teams, that they are ready. They are power, and they got Judge, right? So on top of that, Juan Soto. Yankees made a little bit of cushion in division. It's not really intact. It was a battle all season long. Didn't really turn out to be one by the end here, but the Yankees are on number 2 and number 1. 1-0 against Atlanta. 2-1 against Miami, 2-1 against Colorado. So, not amazing. 5-2 week. Pretty good week. If you win 5-2 every week, you'd be ecstatic. The big thing here, of course, we got to give a round of applause. Shohei Ohtani starting, the 50 club. That's 50 home runs and 50 stolen bases. But like everyone else on this team, we got to point out that the Dodgers do have their weaknesses. The depth of pitching is going to be a concern, definitely when it comes to playoffs. But the one bonus they're going to have is they do have this man Shohei Ohtani, and we saw what he is capable of in that 6-for-6 game where they scored 20 runs against the Marlins. We see what they're capable of, and when it's a best of 5, which they're going to get to skip over the best of 3 situations, this guy is going to have an impact one way or another. And I think that of all the teams on this board, of course, he is the most impactful player. And it's a team that you gotta look at this roster. They got solid bats all throughout. Maybe pitching is a little bit questionable. They all, of course, lose Glass now for the rest. They lose other guys, Stone, I think. But at the end of the day, it's the Dodgers. They've set themselves up very nicely. They do bring in Jack Flaherty, who is going to be impactful in a best of 5, right? So there you have it, guys. The end of the 2024 season coming up this week. The end of the power rankings for this season coming up this week right now. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know what you guys are most excited about coming up into this postseason. Do you have any predictions? How are the playoff spots going to end up between 9 and 16, I guess, if you're counting the Twins? I know Boston's not really in it, but overall, that's where you're at. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching. We'll see you for that next video.